Well, good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Happy Father's Day. Well, today we're going to continue our series in the spiritual disciplines. We've been in this for 5 or 6 weeks now, so I'm not going to do a big intro. If you missed any of those, you can go watch them on YouTube. But the basic premise is this. We want to develop habits modeled after the life of Jesus that create time and space for God to actually encounter us and for us to be transformed into his character. That's the goal, that we are transformed into the image and character of Christ. But it doesn't just happen to you. You have to be intentional about spending time and intentional about putting yourself in situations and circumstances that cause you to be uncomfortable, that cause you to grow. It's the same way it works in anything else. Nobody wants to go to the gym and work out, but you develop the habit for it. You put yourself in these situations that cause you to have to grow. And so we want to do this individually and as a church, corporately growing into the character of the Lord. And for the last few weeks, we've been focusing on solitude. And this is just the practice of removing yourself from noise, from relationships, from noise, from distractions of your cell phone, from the noise of TV, and just getting alone in a really quiet place and just sitting there and trying to encounter the Lord. Maybe you pray, whatever you do, you just sit there in silence. And some of you guys that I've been talking to, man, this practice has been life-giving. You love it. It's feeding your soul. It's awesome. But the majority of the people that I've talked to, that is not the case. That is not the case at all. You're having a really hard time. And what happens is, what you can find is that when you get alone and you get in the solitude and you get into the quiet, something might happen to you. You might get overwhelmed by emotion. All of a sudden, some of you are just bursting into tears. You don't even know why. You're weeping, or you feel this deep sense of loneliness or fear, and these things just erupt out of you. And the temptation is to run away from it, to get out of it. But what's happening is, because we live so addicted to noise, because we live so distracted and our lives are so busy all the time, that those feelings are inside of you and they've been trying to catch up with you for a long time, but you haven't noticed them because you're so distracted and you're so used to noise and using things to prevent you from feeling that. And then you enter this solitude and silence, and all of a sudden those feelings just rise to the top, and they can just be overwhelming. They can hit you like a truck and you want to get out of the way, you want to run. But growth happens in feeling it, in processing it. And some of the other people in this, when you sit there, all of a sudden, these thoughts start coming up that you don't like. You start having these really prideful thoughts, or these really insecure thoughts, or these really judgmental thoughts. And you've gone into this thinking, man, I'm going to have this time alone with the Lord. I'm really going to encounter the Lord. And you just end up feeling really exposed, and you don't like what you find out about yourself. You don't like what's coming up in your heart. These things that you really think and feel that you didn't really know you thought and felt that way until you get alone without noise. And it can be a hard experience finding those things out about yourself. And so the question becomes, how do we feel all this stuff? How do we process this in solitude and come out the other side healed from those things? How do we come out with more freedom than we went into it before? And I don't know the answer, but I do know there's a Bible story that seems to talk about this. It's a weird Bible story. We've talked about it before. I'm not entirely sure I know what's going on in this story, but it is about solitude. And so, if you will, turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 19. And I'm going to give you a little rundown, a quick history of what's going on leading to 1 Kings chapter 19. So this comes after the period of David and Solomon. Right after Solomon's 2 sons split the kingdom and they go to civil war. You have 10 tribes in the north that become known as the kingdom of Israel, and then the 2 tribes in the south that become known as the kingdom of Judah. And so the book of 1 Kings follows both sets of kings. And it tells you all about each king of the north and of the south. Some of them are good, some of them are awful, and one of them is especially bad, King Ahab in the north. And the problem with Ahab is he's a petty and a weak man, but he marries a woman named Jezebel, who's a Canaanite princess, and she worships the Canaanite god of Baal. So when she gets married to King Ahab of Israel, she institutes, because he doesn't have a backbone and stand up, she institutes national worship of the Canaanite god Baal. She tears down all the altars to Yahweh, and she starts killing anyone that worships Yahweh. Like, she's a bad chick. She's ruthless. She enforces this with an iron fist. So things are not going great in the kingdom of Israel. And then you get Elijah. God raises up a prophet to Israel during that time, and he is a wild man. We have not seen a prophet like this so far into the Bible. He comes on the scene. He is marked by the miraculous. He's being fed by ravens. He's raising the dead. He's calling fire from heaven. He's multiplying food. He's doing all of this crazy stuff. And then he approaches Ahab and Jezebel, and he confronts them. And he prays that it won't rain for 3 years. And it doesn't. And he pieces out, and they can't find him. And so that's a terrible thing if you live in an agrarian society, that there's no rain. Things are going horrible in Israel at this point. And then eventually it comes to a head where Elijah calls up Ahab and Jezebel, and he's like, all right, we're going to have a WWE style smackdown. We're going to find out whose God is real, Baal or Yahweh. And he calls all of Israel together on Mount Carmel, which is Baal's home turf. It's his holy mountain. It's where Baal is said to dwell. And all of Israel comes together, all of the prophets of Baal, and they have this showdown. They have two sacrifices. They make 2 animal sacrifices on 2 altars, and the prophets of Baal go first, and they're dancing around and they're praying loudly. They're cutting themselves. They're spilling blood trying to get Baal to answer. And Elijah is super cocky the whole time. He's talking mad trash the entire time. Like, oh, maybe your God's in the bathroom. That's why he can't hear you. Maybe your God's asleep. You should cut yourself harder. And he's going off. And eventually they give up. And then Elijah takes 12 jugs of the most precious resource in Israel, water. Hasn't rained in 3 years. And he dumps it all over his sacrifice, and it covers it, and it fills a trench around it, and then he says a tiny prayer. Fire comes down from heaven, consumes the sacrifice, consumes the stones of the altar, consumes the water, proving God's the real God. Yahweh's the real God of Israel. Elijah promptly kills all of the prophets of Baal, 450 people. And so you're like, okay, this is a great day's work for an Old Testament prophet, right? Like, if that was you, you would be like, okay, mission accomplished, most successful day ever. We've dominated the God of the Canaanites. Israel's going to turn back. High note. And then he prays for it to rain, and it rains. And it's like, awesome. This is a crazy story. And so that takes us to 1 Kings chapter 19, where it doesn't work out the way Elijah thought it would. It says, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he'd killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Meaning she's going to kill Elijah, right? So no problem if you're Elijah. I mean, think about everything he's done. God's protected him through everything. He's called down fire. He just walks in the miraculous. He's just killed all of her priestesses. Like, what can Jezebel even do to him at this point? Like, he's the dude. But apparently, when she shoots him that text, up, gonna kill you tomorrow, Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he goes all the way down to the southern kingdom. Like, Elijah is terrified. Something's going on in Elijah. And he goes all the way to the southern kingdoms in Judah, and he leaves his servant while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He goes into the lonely place. He goes into solitude. Something's happening inside Elijah, and he doesn't know how to process this. And he goes and he enters silence. He enters solitude. And he comes to a broom bush. It's kind of like a little 10-foot tree. And he sat down under it, and he prayed that he might die. Said, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And he laid down under the bush and he fell asleep. So he goes from the biggest victory of his prophetic ministry to wishing he died right after it. Just got to take my life. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. So what's going on there? He enters solitude, and as soon as he gets by himself, he spends a day in solitude, and he just breaks down. He just breaks down. He's like, God, I want to die. God, I'm no better than my ancestors. I just want to die. And so what I think is going on here is things did not work out the way Elijah thought they would. God did not do what Elijah thought he was going to do. He did all these miracles. He did all this crazy stuff. But Jezebel's still there. Jezebel's still queen of Israel. Jezebel's still trying to kill him. Israel didn't turn from Baal. They're still worshiping Baal after all of that. After everything he's done, Elijah's sitting there like, man, nobody's listening to me. What is my life worth? My job was to call Israel back to you, God, and we've done all this and nothing happened. Nothing changed. It's like he's so disappointed in how his life has turned out and what God hasn't done. That he's just like, I give up, man. I give up. And spending time in just a day of solitude has crushed Elijah. He already had something going on, but he gets there and he just breaks down. And look what God does. It says, all at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And Elijah looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and he drank and then he laid down again. He goes back to sleep. Like Elijah is so used to the miraculous that even an angel cooking him breakfast is like, okay, and he eats food and he just goes right back to sleep. But there's something to this, actually, though, is that sometimes the best thing for our spiritual life is just to sleep, just to rest, man. The angel didn't say, wake up, Elijah, pray hard. He didn't say, hey, wake up and do something. He said, man, Elijah, eat this food, drink this water. You're worn out, man. You're tired. Yeah. And we get like that. Yeah. Like we're so over busy in our lives. We're so over busy with everything that we do. We just run ourselves into the ground, and then we don't have any energy to actually pursue God at all. We don't have the capacity that God, if God was trying to speak to us, to even receive it. We're just run down a lot of the time. And man, Elijah has been busy for the Lord. He's been doing stuff for God. He's been busy. And then the moment he gets time alone, he just breaks down. And God's prescription is like, hey, eat some snacks and let's take a rest. Elijah, go sleep. And he does, and he rests. And he just does it. And we go so hard and we stay so busy a lot of times that when we get home, we don't have that energy and capacity to do the things that truly give us life, like being in the presence of the Lord, reading our Bible, praying, spending time. All we have energy to do is things that ultimately harm us. We just veg out on social media and our mind's not engaged, and we're just looking at things that make us more depressed, or you turn to pornography, or you turn to over drinking, or you're doing all this stuff that doesn't give you rest and actually exacerbates the problem, but it feels like all you have the energy to do, or shopping on Amazon or whatever it is. Like we do things that don't require anything of us for a momentary feel good, but we don't get any rest out of this. And so look what happens. He just goes to sleep, and then again, the angel of the Lord comes back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and he ate and he drank. And you're like, what journey? Elijah's running for his life. He's running away from God. He's not supposed to be here. God had told him to do something else in the previous chapter. And instead of doing that, he ran away. So what journey? God's being so gracious to Elijah. He's like, hey, I know you're running away because you don't trust me to protect you from Jezebel, but here's some snacks. And, you take a little rest. But it's like in that moment, the God that was always with Elijah meets him in this place that is his deepest moment of despair in his life. He feels worthless. He feels like his life has been worthless. He feels like God hasn't done the things that he thought God would do. He's disappointed with everything, and God still is just meeting with him in this place of solitude. And it changes something in Elijah, but not much. It says it was strengthened by that food. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So when you see 40 days and 40 nights in the Bible, like alarm bells should go off in your head a little bit, because you see this a lot. Think Jesus in his time in solitude in the wilderness. Think the ark, 40 days and 40 nights. Think Moses on the mountain of God, which references 40 days. And that's not necessarily meant to be literal. That's a common phrase in the Israel deal to mean a long time, as long as it takes, meaning there's work to be done and we'll be here until it gets done. We're going to be in this place until it gets done. Because the distance Elijah traveled was not a 40-day distance. It's tiny. He could have walked this in like a day, 2 days. The point being, Elijah's taking his time. He's processing something. He's being painfully slow about being in this time of solitude. He's working something out in himself. And the text doesn't tell us so far. He's just not in a hurry. We know he's depressed. We know he's tired. We know God's still kind of moving with him. We know he's not into this thing. But one thing to notice, God, during this whole 40 days, 40 nights period, you don't see God spoke to him, or God gave him a prophetic revelation, or God gives him direction, or God doesn't. He doesn't say that. It's just Elijah out there in this time of solitude by himself. And he's wrestling with something. And look where he goes. He goes to the mountain of God. Mount Horeb. This is the same mountain. It's called Mount Sinai. It's the other name for Mount Sinai in the Bible, which is the place where God met Moses for the first time, told him his name, called all of Israel to him on Mount Sinai, revealed himself to all of Israel, gave the covenant to Israel. You know, the covenant that Elijah has been calling them back to this whole time. You haven't been faithful. Turn from Baal. Come back to the covenant. Come back to Yahweh. That's the place that Elijah ends up for some reason. It's like he gets away from all the noise of Jezebel, all the noise of even his own successes, and something happens to him where he's like, you know what? I'm going to go to the mountain of God. I'm going to go where God showed up before. I'm going to go meet with God. If he's there, I'm going to go meet with him face to face. I'm going to see what I can do here. He has a direction. And that he went into a cave is the same Hebrew word for when Moses went into the cleft of the rock. It's the same deal. He goes into the cleft of the rock where God held his hand over Moses and was like, you can see my glory, but only as I pass you by. I'm going to pass you by. God, show me your glory. Okay, go into this cleft of the rock. Elijah goes, it's like he's reenacting Moses' story. It's like he's looking for something from God. It's like he's waiting on God to do something with him, but God hasn't done anything. And so he wants God to speak to him, and God finally does. It says the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, what are you doing here, Elijah? It's like you're expecting this. I'm going to meet with God, and God's like, hey, man, what are you doing? Why are you here? Like, this isn't where I told you to go. Why are you here? And it's like God doesn't ask questions to get an answer, right? God knows why Elijah's here. He's asking this question so Elijah can think about the answer. Why am I here? What happened? I was doing so good. And then I just nosedived. Why am I here? And apparently, something's come up during this time of solitude in Elijah's mind. He spent this time, and he has a better answer than, God, I'm no better than my ancestors, kill me. More stuff's come up. And he says, God, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty, which is true. Elijah has, man. He's loved the Lord. He's done tons of stuff for the Lord. He says the Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars, and they've put your prophets to death with the sword. Like, all that's true. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. And that part's not true. It's like his time in the wilderness, stuff's coming up in Elijah that's not great. So I'm the only one, God. I'm the only one that loves you. I'm the only one that serves you. Now they're trying to kill me too. Man, God, you didn't fix this. I thought you were going to get rid of Jezebel. I thought you were going to get rid of Baal. They're still worshiping Baal. Jezebel's still out there. God, what is the point of all this? And he has all these doubts and like anger towards God about his own life. And it's like some of us have experienced that when you go into these times of solitude. All of a sudden you start feeling all these things. And you're like, what is this? I don't like this about myself. But Elijah seems to know that the only safe place to actually process that is in the presence of the Lord. He goes to where he knows, man, I'm going to meet him. If I go there, God's going to meet me there. And he tells God all this, and it's kind of like, presumptuous and egotistical. I'm the only one left. I've been very zealous for you. Nobody's listening to me. Nobody cares what I have to say. God, what are you doing? And look, God does not answer his questions at all. He doesn't even respond to his self-pity. He says, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And so if you're Elijah, you're like, okay, here it is. God's going to do something crazy. He's going to show me. He's going to answer all my questions. He's going to come through in a huge way. It's going to be this huge miracle. And it says, a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Why would Elijah's expectations be that God would show up in the wind or an earthquake or the fire? It's because that's how he showed up before to Moses. But apparently here, God's not in any of those things. They happen, but the Lord's presence isn't in there. And what's interesting is, it's like God's subverting Elijah's expectations. It's like, this is it. It's going to be like Moses, and I'm going to meet the Lord face to face. And it doesn't happen again like Elijah thought it was going to happen. And in fact, we find out that he didn't even leave the cave. It says, after the fire came a gentle whisper. And that's translated wildly different in all of your Bibles. It can be a still small voice. It can be a calmness. But my favorite is the sound of silence. In some Bibles it says after the fire came the sound of silence. And for some reason, when Elijah hears it, he pulls his cloak over his face, and then he goes out and does what God had told him to do in the first place, to go stand out on the mountain. But he covers his face. It's like, there's the Lord. I found him. He's in the silence. He wasn't in all the big showy stuff. He wasn't in all the big miracles. He was in something so simple and so quiet, so alone. And he goes out and he covers his face like Moses did. And God said, what are you doing here, Elijah? He asked him again. It's like he's giving him a chance to revise his answer. Like, have you thought about this anymore? And it's like, solitude and silence can train us to honor the past, but not cling to it. Like, God's done stuff before. And I think a lot of times we come to God in these moments we're like, God, do it again like you used to. God, do it again like you used to do, or like you did it for somebody else. And that's just not what God does. He's always doing something new. He's always doing something new. And it's like Elijah hasn't grasped that. And he's like trying to recreate the Moses story for some reason. But until he lets go of that, he's not going to be transformed. He's not going to have the change and the clarity that he needs with all of these doubts. And you see that because he gives the exact same word for word answer. This is so weird to me. They have this conversation before. God does the wind, the earthquake, the fire, the still small voice. He asks him the same question. And Elijah gives him word for word the same answer. It's like Elijah's determined to keep wrestling with this thing inside of himself. That he hasn't got the clarity he needs. He hasn't got the resolve that he needs. And I think for us, this is a good sign. This is Elijah, the prophet of God, who's done more miracles than any of us probably ever will, ever see, ever hear of. And even for him, this time of solitude, these feelings of doubt, all this stuff's coming up, and he's not immediately transformed just by experiencing them. This has taken him a long time in solitude. It's more articulate. He's not, I just want to die. He's worked up these feelings, but it doesn't happen in 5 minutes. And I think a lot of us, when we approach this solitude and silence practice, we get by ourselves and we get for 5 minutes, we're like, okay, God, speak to me, nothing. Okay, cool. And we go about our day. And that's great if that's where you start. But this is a very slow process. Dealing with these doubts, dealing with these fears of loneliness, of isolation, of depression, it takes time. It takes time. You don't see the change immediately in yourself. Elijah's been at this for a while, and he's growing. His answer has changed. It's more articulate. He understands more about why he's this, but he's not fixed yet, if you will. He's named it. He's felt all the feelings. He's named it in the presence of the Lord. He's put it all on the table, but nothing has really changed in Elijah. And look what God's response is. The Lord said to him, go back where you came from. Go back where you were, where I told you to be. Go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram, which was a different country. Also, anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Maholah, I guess? I don't know. To succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escaped the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escaped the sword of Jehu. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, whose mouths have not kissed him. So what is all this? How is this an answer to Elijah's accusations and like self-pity? It's like he's saying, look, go back where you came from. Go back to what you were supposed to be doing, because I've got it under control. I've got it under control. Jezebel's going to be dealt with. And it's going to happen this way. It's going to happen through Jehu. It's going to happen through Elisha. It may not be the way you wanted it to look. It may not be the way you expected it to look, but I promise you I've got it covered. I promise you I'm in control. I promise you that it's not about you. And that's that thing that he wraps up there. He's like, Elijah, man, there's still 7,000 people that worship me. If we know anything about the Bible, is God can do a lot with one person. There's 7,000 people. And he's like, Elijah, man, I'm always moving. My plan is always unfolding before you. You're not the center of everything. And what this does is it gives Elijah, in my mind, clarity. Something in this answer seems to fix Elijah, because when he leaves this cave, he's back to normal baller Elijah, doing Elijah stuff. So this is the darkest moment. Somehow, it's like God is telling him, hey, Elijah, your worth is not dependent on how people respond to you, or whether or not Israel rejects you, or whether or not Israel comes back into the covenant with me. That's not your worth. That's not your identity. Your identity isn't whether or not you succeed at the task I've given you to do. It's that you do it, that you're with me, that you spend time with me, that we do this. And that answer seems to fix Elijah for some reason. And it's like silence and solitude. They just train you to be present with God. It's like God's always been there with Elijah. He's always been there. But Elijah just couldn't hear it after his big success, and things didn't work out the way he wanted. He just couldn't hear it anymore. And he fell apart. And it was only through this time in solitude and silence that he regained this knowledge that he had about God. And God even goes one step further. He's like, hey, I'm going to give you a friend and someone to mentor, and Elisha, and he's going to be with you. And it's like when he finally hears what God's speaking to him, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, you do have this under control. Yeah, man, I've been tired. I've been worn out. You're giving me a friend to do this with now too? You've got this all under control? Okay. And it just comes to this place where Elijah is like, understands God's perspective. And I think that might be the biggest thing about silence and solitude, is that once you can quiet yourself, once you can fight that urge to be distracted or to run away from the feelings or to run away from the things in yourself that you don't like, if you determine to sit in it, all of a sudden you might start to shift. You might start to hear God speaking over your life. And you might start to get his perspective on the circumstances that you're going through. And when you do that, it brings healing to your heart. I think one of Elijah's biggest deals is that, man, my life isn't worth anything. I've worked so hard and I don't have anything to show for it. The result I wanted didn't happen. And God meets him in it. And it's just like, it's okay. It's okay. You've done what I've asked you to do. Just keep doing it. Keep being with me. Keep doing it. And the thing with us is that God is nearer to us than the breath in our lungs. He's all around us. We just can't feel him most of the time because we pressed it all down with distraction and with noise. And when we do that, we'll just try to find the solution in other relationships in our life. We'll expect our spouse to fix things inside of us that they cannot fix. We'll expect our kids to give us meaning and worth that they cannot give us. We'll expect our job to give us meaning and worth that it cannot give us. And we chase all these things deeply wanting, but scared to be fixed. And in this story, Elijah's like, he just brings it all to God, and he's like, bah, this is it, man. I'm just fed up. I'm fed up. You haven't done what I wanted you to do. And God doesn't strike him down. He's gracious with him over and over in this story. And how scary would that be to be Elijah and just be like, God, this is it. And just really be honest with how you feel to the Lord. And he responds with grace. If you show up to the wilderness, if you show up to that time of isolation, if you give yourself time and space to actually process who you are and what's going on inside of you, and to do it in the presence of the Lord, it can radically transform your view of yourself and your view of God. But it's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to be honest with God. It's hard to sit there until you get God's perspective. It's hard to sit there until the voices of the Jezebels in your life fade away, until the voices of your own pride fades away, until you really realize who you are. And then you bring that to God. Because God's not going to meet the person you wish you were. God doesn't meet you where you wish you were in life, who you want to be. He meets you right where you are. But as long as we're pretending that's not us, we don't encounter him. You can't. God doesn't talk to this idol that you've made of yourself. He wants to talk to your heart. And silence and solitude is how we get there. So as the ministry team comes up, we'll close with this. If you're having trouble with this practice, you're not alone. This is like one of the most important practices, but it's also the hardest because it requires the most out of you. It requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to be honest with yourself and with God. And it requires you to fight those distractions, to fight all those things. And it is so slow. It takes time. Think about a plant growing. Think about how many days, if you planted a seed and you just watched it, you would never really notice it's growing. It happens so slow that you just can't even see it happening. And it's so slow. But God brings the growth. He brings it. You plant the seed. You spend the time in the moments that are uncomfortable. You spend the time being intentional about being with the Lord. And God starts to do something in your heart and in your mind, but it doesn't happen in 5 minutes. It happens over a lifetime of just being intentional and walking with him, spending time in it. Because God's presence changes you, whether you see it or not. What happens is you don't feel any different. Then all of a sudden some outside circumstance comes and you react in a totally different way than you would have 2 years ago. And you're like, man, I have changed. God has been doing something in me. But you only realize it when some outside thing that used to destroy you all of a sudden doesn't. It doesn't destroy you anymore. And you're like, oh, that's what's been happening. I have changed. And I think Elijah just needed that. He just needed time and space to process his life with God and for God to change his perspective. And so as we go on this week and we do this, know you're not alone. If you're a person that gets alone in the silence and you just break down and you just feel so lonely, or you feel so sad, or you feel scared, I want to encourage you not to run away from it, but to just give it to the Lord and say, man, this is how I feel. God, why do I feel this way? God, show me why I feel this way. Show me what's going on in my heart. God, I give it to you. Because I know you're good, and I know you're a safe place to do this. I know you'll take care of me. I know you have it under control. I know you don't need me, but you love me. And you care for me, Father. Have your way in me. So God, we just come before you right now and we thank you. We thank you that you're gracious even when we're unfaithful, even when we're scared, when we're confused. God, when we're frustrated that our life hasn't worked out the way we thought it would, when we're frustrated that you haven't moved the way we thought you would, you haven't done the things we thought you should do, God, we're so thankful that we can just come to you with that. You know it anyways. God, and then when we're just honest with you and we spend time in your presence, Father, that you are faithful to do what you said you would do, to transform us into the character of Christ. And to stir up your Holy Spirit in us. And it may be slow, but man, everything in life that is good and great and of you is worth it. It may be hard, but it's worth it. So if you need prayer today, come get prayer. It's in your name we pray. Amen.